What if the woman who fell asleep on your shoulder wasn't just running from her past, but was about to change your future forever? She didn't say a word when she boarded the plane, just clutched her feverish baby to her chest and sank into the seat beside him, like gravity had finally won. Her coat was thin, too thin for Utah winter. Her lips were chapped, her cheeks red with windburn, and her eyes, they looked past him, through him, like she was holding herself together by a single fraying thread. Julian Westbrook noticed all of it. But he didn't ask. He simply took off his old, oversized firefighter coat and offered it with both hands. "Here," he said quietly. "She's burning up." The woman blinked at him, startled. For a second, she looked like she might protest, say something about being fine. But the baby whimpered, a thin, painful sound, and she just nodded. Julian wrapped the coat gently around the child. The fabric nearly swallowed her, but she stopped fussing. Then he sat back, hands in his lap, not expecting anything. "I'm Julian," he said softly. She glanced at him, her voice rough from exhaustion. "Amelia." They didn't speak again for a while. The airport around them buzzed in half-silence, announcements, shuffling footsteps, the vending machines humming in the distance. Most people were sleeping, or pretending to. It was Christmas Eve after all. And the magic had long worn off. Julian leaned back against the hard plastic seat. He was only flying to Boise for a funeral. No family, no celebration. Just an old music teacher who had kept sending him Christmas cards long after the rest of the world stopped checking in. The baby let out a tiny cry. Amelia rocked her gently, but her arms were trembling. She looked like she hadn't rested in days. "Let me," Julian said, offering his arms. She hesitated, looked at him. Not with fear, but something closer to shame, like she hated needing help. Still, she handed the baby over. A small, flushed face peeked out from the edge of the coat. She was warm, too warm. But she relaxed against his chest instantly, trusting him in a way adults forget how to. Amelia let out a shaky breath. Then, slowly, like her bones couldn't carry her anymore, she leaned her head against his shoulder. It wasn't planned, it wasn't romantic, it was human. And that was enough. Julian sat there, still as stone, holding a stranger's child while a stranger slept on his shoulder. Her breathing deepened. Her fingers unclenched. Time passed in the quiet way it does when no one is watching. A janitor pushing a mop paused near them. He didn't interrupt, just pulled out his phone and took a single photo. No flash. No noise. Then he kept moving. Around 3:40 a.m., a boarding call crackled through the speaker. Amelia stirred, sat up quickly, rubbing her eyes. "Did I fall asleep?" Julian nodded. "You needed it." She looked down at her daughter, then back at him. There was something tight in her throat when she spoke. "Thank you." He gave a soft smile. "It's Christmas Eve. No one should be cold or alone." They stood and walked to the gate together. They didn't say anything more. They didn't need to. She still didn't know he'd once run into burning buildings for a living. He still didn't know she'd once been the face of a Manhattan Society magazine. All they knew was this: a shoulder, a sleeping baby, and a silence that for once didn't hurt to sit in. What neither of them saw coming was that this small, unspoken moment would become the first page in a story neither of them had dared to hope for. And somewhere above Salt Lake City, as the snow kept falling in soft white waves, two strangers sat side by side on a red-eye flight. A mother, a daughter, and a man learning quietly how to breathe again. Julian hadn't planned to speak again, not on the plane, not after the baby drifted off, and Amelia leaned into his shoulder like she was finally giving her body permission to collapse. He just sat there, staring at the little oval window, watching snow blur the outside world into quiet smudges of white and grey. He used to like Christmas, back when there was a reason. Back when he had a house full of laughter, a dog that barked every time the tree lights blinked, and a woman who tucked cinnamon sticks into his coat pocket because firefighters shouldn't smell like smoke all the time. But that was 5 years ago. Before the fire. Before he lost her. Before the job stopped being a calling and started feeling like a punishment. He hadn't saved them. Not the neighbors. Not his own wife. Not even himself. Since then, he had learned to live small. Quiet, invisible, an apartment with one fork, one chair, and a bed he never fully slept in. So when the baby sighed in his arms like she belonged there, something inside him cracked. Softly. Quietly. Like the first break in ice before the thaw. Beside him, Amelia didn't move, but her breathing deepened. And Julian found himself listening to it like a lullaby he didn't know he missed. He glanced at her from the corner of his eye. She couldn't have been more than 25. Her hair was pinned back in a loose bun, strands falling across her cheek. There was no ring on her hand, no makeup. Just exhaustion and silence wrapped around her like armor. He wondered where she was going, what she was running from. Or to. But he didn't ask, because he understood what it meant to carry something too heavy to name. The flight rocked gently. The captain's voice came over the intercom, low and practiced. Julian didn't catch most of it, just expected arrival, light snow in Boise, and thank you for flying with us. He looked down at the baby again. Her name was Grace. Amelia had whispered it once, right before falling asleep. Grace. Julian shifted slightly, careful not to wake either of them. He didn't believe in signs, not anymore. But the name stuck with him, the way it curled against his ribs, the way it reminded him that maybe, just maybe, life wasn't entirely done, offering him small, quiet chances. Amelia stirred a bit, her head adjusting against his shoulder, but she didn't wake. She looked peaceful. But not the kind of peace that comes easy. The kind you earn, after long nights, missed meals, whispered prayers no one hears. He wanted to ask her something. Anything, just to hear her voice again. But he didn't want to take her peace away. So he stayed still, letting her borrow his silence, letting her rest. When the plane finally touched down, she blinked awake slowly, looked at him with the dazed, hesitant look of someone who forgot where they were. I drooled on you, didn't I? She murmured. Julian smiled. You're good. She sat up straighter, adjusting the baby in her arms. Then she looked at him. Really looked. You said your name's Julian, she said. He nodded. Julian? What? Westbrook. The name made her pause. Not because it meant anything to her, but because it sounded familiar in a way she couldn't place. She nodded. I'm Amelia Carter, she said softly, then added, as if it mattered. I used to be someone else. Julian didn't ask what that meant. He just nodded. Some names, some pasts, are too heavy to carry in a single sentence. I haven't slept like that in weeks, she whispered. Months, maybe. He looked at her gently. Babies will do that to you. She smiled, just barely. You got kids? Julian's eyes darkened slightly. Almost. Once. Amelia looked away, not to avoid him. But out of respect. The kind of respect that comes from shared pain. I'm sorry, she said. It's all right, he replied. Some losses get heavier when you carry them alone. They walked slowly toward the front of the plane. Passengers moved like ghosts, hunched over their carry-ons, rubbing sleep from their eyes. Julian turned to her. You have family in Boise? She nodded once. Unfinished business. He nodded too. I'm just going to a funeral. I'm sorry. Me too. As they reached the gate, she turned to him. I don't usually fall asleep on strangers. Julian chuckled. I don't usually offer my shoulder to them. They both smiled. The kind of smile that doesn't reach the mouth fully, just the eyes, and the memory. Then a voice broke the air. "Miss Carter, we've been looking for you." A man in a grey suit stood near the glass doors, holding a leather folder. Two others in dark coats stood behind him. Amelia froze. The baby stirred in her arms. Julian stepped slightly closer, protective without even thinking. The man spoke again. "Your grandfather passed away last night. The estate is waiting." Amelia's breath caught. She turned to Julian, stunned. "I wasn't sure I was ready to come back," she whispered. Julian didn't touch her. Didn't say anything dramatic, just looked at her with soft steadiness. "Maybe the world's ready for you." She stared at him for a long moment, then turned and followed the men toward the exit. Julian stayed where he was. He didn't have a place in this moment. He wasn't family, wasn't a friend, just a man with a coat, a shoulder, and 2 quiet hours, but something in him tugged. Like maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end. And then just as she reached the door, Amelia turned back. She looked at him. Eyes tired, voice barely above a whisper. "Would you come with me?" Julian didn't know why he said yes. Maybe it was the way Amelia looked at him, half hoping he'd decline, half praying he wouldn't. Maybe it was the baby, still bundled in his coat, cheeks flushed, her tiny fingers curling unconsciously around a strand of Amelia's hair. Or maybe it was something quieter. Something he hadn't felt in years, like being needed for more than just a favor. So he followed her out of the terminal. No words, just footsteps, and a question he hadn't figured out how to ask. What now? A black sedan waited at the curb. The suited man opened the door. Amelia hesitated for a beat, then ducked inside with the baby still asleep on her shoulder. Julian climbed in beside her. They didn't speak during the ride. Boise rolled past the windows like a city holding its breath. Snow fell in slow flurries, now gentler than before. Amelia kept her hand on the baby's back the entire ride, fingers rising and falling with every small breath. Julian sat across from her, watching the streetlights flicker through the fogged-up glass. Finally, she spoke. "Her name's Grace," she said, her voice just above a whisper. "Like the word," he smiled. "Fits her." "My mother used to say wrens were the bravest birds," Amelia continued. "Small, quiet, but always find their way home." Julian looked at her, something catching in his chest. "You named her Grace Wren?" Amelia nodded. "I needed to believe she'd make it, even when I wasn't sure I could." Silence returned, but not the heavy kind. More like an understanding. Two people sitting with the weight of what they hadn't said yet. When the car pulled into the driveway, Julian leaned forward slightly. It wasn't a house. It was an estate. Stone columns, iron gates, hedges trimmed into perfection, cold light spilling from windows taller than any person needed. Julian's boots suddenly felt too worn, his coat too faded. He was out of place. And he knew it. But Amelia didn't seem to notice. She stepped out, baby still in arms, head held high, like muscle memory had kicked in the daughter of privilege, walking back into a world she once abandoned. He followed her inside. The air smelled like old books, polished wood, and something floral he couldn't name. A butler nodded and led them down a long corridor into a room that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. There, a lawyer waited with a leather satchel and an envelope sealed in red wax. Amelia stood still as he read aloud. Julian didn't catch every word: property, shares, holdings, transfer of title. But then the lawyer's tone changed, softer, more human. To Amelia, he read, "You were always the quietest of my legacy, but perhaps the most watchful. I regret what I said when you left. Not because I didn't mean it, but because I did." Amelia's shoulders tensed. Julian saw it. He said, "If you walk away, don't expect to be welcomed back." She murmured, not to the room, just to herself. The lawyer continued, "You chose love over image. That used to be weakness in my eyes. Now, it's the only strength I envy." Julian swallowed hard. Across from him, Amelia lowered her head. Silent tears tracked down her cheeks. "I leave you this home, not out of obligation, but because it needs someone who can make it gentle again." Julian looked at her then, and for the first time since he met her, he didn't just see the tired young mother from the airport. He saw a woman returning to a battlefield and choosing not to retreat. Later, after the reading, Amelia stepped out into the back garden. Grace was asleep again, bundled against her chest. Julian followed at a distance, careful not to intrude. Snow blanketed the stone paths. The hedges were overgrown. A fountain, frozen solid, stood in the center like a memory refusing to melt. Amelia sat on a bench beneath a leafless tree. She didn't speak, she just looked up at the sky. "I thought he hated me," she said eventually. "Maybe he didn't," Julian answered. "Maybe he just couldn't bend until it was too late." She turned to look at him. There was something raw in her face. Not pain, not quite. Something closer to being seen. "Why did you stay?" she asked. Julian exhaled. He didn't know how to explain it. How to put into words the feeling of holding that baby, of watching Amelia breathe in her sleep, of realizing too late that he hadn't felt human in years. "Because," he said finally, "you looked like someone who needed a place to land." Amelia looked down at Grace, then back at him. Maybe I wasn't the only one. The next morning the house was quiet. Still cold. Still too big. But different. Amelia sat at the long kitchen table, a mug of tea in her hands. Grace slept in a bassinet nearby, cheeks pink, no longer fevered. Julian entered slowly, coffee in hand. "You okay?" he asked. Amelia nodded. "Still feels like I'm walking through someone else's life." He sat down across from her. "You are," he said. "But maybe that's how new stories start." She looked at him. And for the first time she smiled. Not the polite kind, not the tired kind. A real one. The kind that says, "I made it through the night." The dining room hadn't changed. Same chandelier, same heavy oak table, same walls that never learned how to hold warmth. Amelia stood just inside the doorway, holding Grace in one arm, her fingers brushing against the faded wallpaper like she was searching for something she used to believe in. Julian stayed behind her, unsure if he should follow. The whole house felt like a museum curated by ghosts. "He never redecorated," Amelia said softly. "Even after my mother died." Julian looked around. Nothing in the room hinted at life. Only preservation and pride. She walked slowly to the fireplace and stared up at the mantel. A photograph sat framed in silver, her grandfather, Richard Carter, stern-faced. Jaw clenched, the kind of man who didn't ask for forgiveness. He expected the world to adjust. Julian watched her closely. "You don't have to stay here," he said gently. "Just because someone leaves you a house doesn't mean you owe them your life." Amelia didn't turn, but she nodded. "I know," she whispered, "but maybe it's not about what I owe him." She looked down at Grace, sleeping in her arms. "Maybe it's about what I owe her." They walked through the house together, room by room, not reminiscing. Just observing. The piano room still had the same dust-covered bench. "I used to sneak down here and play at night," Amelia said. "When I couldn't sleep, when I felt invisible." Julian looked at her. "And now?" She looked around. "Now I want this room to echo with different things." In the study, they found his journal. Thick, bound in leather. Tucked away in a locked drawer, her grandfather must have assumed she'd never open. Julian stepped back as Amelia opened it. She didn't flip through the pages. She simply held it in her hands, closed her eyes and exhaled. "I'm not ready," she whispered. You don't have to be, Julian said. Later that day, a woman named Harper arrived. Professional, polished, but kind. I was Mr. Carter's assistant for 10 years, she explained. He wasn't always easy, but he asked me to bring this to you if you ever returned. She handed Amelia a small box. Inside were keepsakes. A photo of Amelia at age 7 grinning with 2 missing teeth, a dried flower from her high school graduation bouquet, and a note. Handwritten. 1 sentence. I never stopped watching, even when I didn't know how to speak. Amelia didn't cry, not right away, but Julian saw the way her hand trembled as she set the note down. The way her breath caught when Harper said, he donated to the women's shelter in Chicago, monthly, anonymously. Amelia blinked. He knew where I was. Harper nodded. Always. He just didn't know how to say he missed you. They sat on the back patio that evening. The garden hadn't been touched in years. Dead leaves clung to the hedges. Snow still coated the old stone path. But in the distance, crocuses were starting to push through the soil. I thought he hated me, Amelia said quietly. Julian looked at her. I don't think he hated you, he replied. I think he hated that you had the courage to walk away from something he never did. She looked at him then. Really looked. You always say things like that. Julian smiled, just barely, only when I believe them. Grace stirred in her arms. Amelia adjusted her gently, brushing a hand across her daughter's cheek. You make her feel safe, she said. She makes me feel something I forgot I could. Amelia's voice dropped to almost a whisper. I didn't think I'd ever come back here. Didn't think I'd be strong enough to face it. But the hardest part wasn't stepping back through the doors. She looked toward the house. It was believing I deserved to. Julian didn't answer with words. Answer. He just reached out and placed his hand over hers, not to pull, not to hold. Just to say I'm here. The next morning the light was different, not warmer necessarily, but clearer, less like memory, more like morning. Amelia stood in her childhood bedroom, Grace tucked into the crook of her arm. The wallpaper was faded blue. There were still initials carved into the window frame. GC plus AC. She smiled. My brother dared me to carve that when I was 10, she said. Julian leaned against the doorway, arms folded. You miss him? She nodded. He disappeared into the world like I disappeared from this house. They stood in silence a moment longer. Then Amelia said something that surprised even her. I want to stay. Julian didn't move. I want Grace to grow up in a place that smells like pancakes and crayon wax, not leather and silence. He smiled. You going to build her a fort in the closet? Only if you help. He nodded. I will. That night, she lit the fireplace in the study for the first time in over a decade. Not a housekeeper, not a staff member. Her, Amelia, with soot on her fingers and kindling that wouldn't catch the first 3 times she tried. But it did. Eventually, it did. And as the fire crackled to life, Julian looked at her across the room and thought, this is what healing looks like. Not grand, not glamorous, just slow human light returning to the dark corners. The snow kept falling, but inside the estate, something had begun to soften. Not dramatically, not all at once, but like a frozen river beginning to crack in the quiet places. Julian didn't rush anything. He woke early, made coffee, fixed a creaky door hinge. He stayed out of the way when Amelia needed space and closed when she didn't ask but didn't want to be alone. There was no talk of what they were, no titles, no promises, just presence. He read in the drawing room while she rocked Grace by the fire. He held the baby while she made lunch. She laughed the first time he burned the grilled cheese. You're lucky she's not old enough to complain, Amelia teased, nodding toward Grace. Julian looked down at the baby in his arms, She was asleep again, one chubby hand curled into the collar of his shirt. "I think she's just being polite," he whispered. That was how their days moved. Simple, unforced, but never meaningless. One afternoon, Amelia stood in the hallway outside the music room. She hadn't gone back in since the night of the will reading. Now she rested her hand on the doorknob. "Come with me?" she asked, without turning. Julian stepped beside her. The piano sat just as they left it. A light film of dust had settled on the keys. The bench creaked when she sat down. "I don't know if I remember," she said softly. "You don't forget what made you feel alive," he replied. Amelia looked at him, then placed her fingers on the keys. The first note wavered. The second was too sharp. But the third was right. She began to play, tentative at first, then fuller, stronger. It was a lullaby, the same one she hummed on the plane that night. Julian closed his eyes. It wasn't perfect, but it was beautiful. When she finished, she looked up at him. "Your turn," she said. He blinked. "I can barely play Twinkle, Twinkle." "Then start there." She scooted over on the bench. He sat down beside her, awkward and stiff. Their hands shared the keys, fumbling and off rhythm. But their laughter filled the room, and for a moment, the estate didn't feel haunted. It felt lived in. That night, as snow piled against the windows and the fire danced behind the grate, they sat together in the quiet. Grace was asleep upstairs. Huck, the rescue mutt Julian, convinced her to adopt, snored gently by their feet. "You're not what I expected," Amelia said, staring into the fire. Julian raised an eyebrow. "Is that good or bad?" She smiled. "I think it's what I needed." He didn't respond right away, just nodded. "You make it easy to stay," he said finally. She turned to him, her voice lower now. "Why did you follow me off that plane?" Julian thought for a long moment. "I've walked away from a lot of things," he said. "But for the first time in years, I didn't want to wonder what would have happened if I hadn't." She looked down at her hands. "I was scared you'd leave. I was scared I'd ruin it by staying." They both laughed, soft, nervous laughter that came from the edge of something unspoken. "I don't need a savior," she said. "I know. I just need someone who's still there when I look up." Julian met her gaze. "I don't want to be anywhere else." The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was full, like breath held gently between two people who finally knew they were safe. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I don't know what this is yet," she said. "Me neither," he whispered. "But I know it's real." Grace stirred upstairs. The house creaked. The fire popped. And neither of them moved. Because sometimes love doesn't begin with declarations or perfect timing. Sometimes it starts with two people brave enough to sit in the silence together. The change didn't come all at once. It rarely does. It came in moments. In smells. In sound. The first sign was cinnamon. Amelia started baking again. At first, it was just banana bread. Something simple. Something familiar. The scent drifted through the halls like music no one remembered they missed. Julian found her one morning in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, hair messy, Grace giggling in a bouncer seat on the floor. There was flour on Amelia's cheek and peace in the air. "You're up early," she said without looking up. Julian leaned against the doorway, smiling. "I smelled hope." She laughed. Not a polite laugh. A real one. The next sign came from the piano room. Music returned, not every day, not perfectly, but enough to remind the house it wasn't meant to be quiet. And then there were the doors. They stopped being closed. Amelia began opening windows even when it was still cold outside. Letting in air, letting out ghosts. One afternoon, Julian caught her in the West Wing, a part of the house that had been sealed for over a decade. "What are you doing in here?" he asked. She turned, hands dusty, eyes bright. Taking back space, she said. This house has been silent for too long. Together, they pulled old sheets off forgotten furniture. Light hit antique mirrors for the first time in years. There were creaks and cobwebs, yes, but there was also warmth beginning to gather in the corners. They turned the old nursery into Grace's room. Julian sanded the floorboards by hand. Amelia hung string lights and painted stars on the ceiling. They placed a cedar chest in the corner one her mother had kept and filled it with books, blankets, and dreams. "She'll grow into this space," Amelia whispered one night, watching her daughter sleep. "And it won't belong to shadows." Word began to spread, not through newspapers, not online, but through people. The local florist saw Amelia at the market. The librarian remembered her from childhood. The women at the shelter whispers passed between them. "She's back. She's different. She's trying." Amelia didn't announce her return. She simply showed up. With muffins, with winter coats, with handwritten notes tucked into donated boots that read, "You are not forgotten." One letter became 2, then 10, then 50. Renee Carter, the director of the shelter, called one evening. "I've never seen this many mothers smile in January," she said. "You didn't just come back, Amelia. You brought light with you." Amelia looked across the room. Julian was reading on the couch. Grace was curled beside him, playing with Huck's ears. She smiled softly. "I didn't bring it alone." The house changed around them. Julian replaced rusted hinges. Amelia cleared out the old greenhouse, already dreaming of lavender and rosemary. They bought mismatched chairs from second-hand shops and lined them up in the garden. Not for a party, not for a gala, but for an afternoon tea with no cameras, just conversation. Children ran across the lawn. Neighbors wandered in. Renee poured lemonade beside Amelia like they'd been doing it for years. Julian stood by the porch, watching it all. He'd once lived in a world where everything could burn. Now he stood in a place where things grew, not fast, not easily, but steadily. That night, as the sun dipped behind the pines and the last guests left, Amelia sat on the porch swing. Julian joined her, Grace asleep between them. "This doesn't feel like Langford Estate anymore," she said. Julian looked at her. "That's because it isn't," he said. She turned her head. "It's starting to feel like home." The letter came on a Wednesday. Cream envelope. Gold trim, embossed with the Langford Foundation seal. Amelia knew what it meant the moment she saw it. She didn't even have to open it, but she did. Inside was a formal request for her attendance at an emergency board session. The tone was courteous. The subtext wasn't. They wanted answers. Why the estate wasn't hosting its annual winter gala. Why the foundation's discretionary budget had been redirected toward women's shelters, food banks, job training. Why there were no press releases. No photo ops, no interviews. They were polite in print. But Amelia had grown up learning how power asked questions it had already decided the answers to. Julian found her standing by the fireplace, the letter open in her hands. "They want to know what I'm doing," she said without looking at him. "Why I'm investing in people instead of portfolios." He said nothing, just waited. "I don't want to defend myself," she added. "I want to explain it once, and never again." Julian nodded. "Then tell them the truth." She looked at him. "I want you with me." He blinked. "You sure?" "This isn't just my house anymore," she said. "It's becoming our home." 2 days later, they walked into the Langford Foundation boardroom together. Polished wood, glossy surfaces, 12 men in tailored suits. Amelia wore a simple black dress. No jewelry, no heels. Just steady breath and quiet strength. Julian sat beside her, not as a guard, not as a shield, as presence. One of the board members cleared his throat. "We appreciate your time, Ms. Carter," he said. his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "We're curious about the direction you're taking the estate." She folded her hands. "I'm not taking the estate in a direction," she replied. "I'm returning it to purpose." A few eyebrows lifted. She continued. "My grandfather built this foundation on the idea of legacy, of endurance, of name." She paused. "But somewhere along the way we forgot that names don't build legacies. People do." There was silence. Then someone asked, "Are you implying we've misused his vision?" Amelia looked directly at him. "I'm saying his vision evolved, and so should we." Julian watched as she spoke, not loudly, not defensively, but with the clarity of someone who had lived too long in silence to waste breath on performance. "I'm investing in women who've been told they have no value unless they return something. I'm funding trade programs, mental health counseling, emergency housing, not because it looks good on paper, but because that's what legacy actually means, building something that matters when no one's watching." The room shifted. Uneasy, but listening, she finished with one sentence. "I'm not preserving Langford's name. I'm rebuilding what it means." They left the meeting without shaking hands, and she didn't look back. That night, Julian found her in the greenhouse. It was nearly finished now. The panes had been scrubbed, the structure reinforced. Lavender and rosemary had already taken root. Amelia stood in the center, cradling Grace in one arm, her fingers tracing the sign Julian had helped her nail to the back wall. "Grace's garden, a place named not for power, but for new beginnings." "She'll grow up here," Amelia whispered. Not in fear, not in performance, just whole. Julian stepped beside her. "You're changing the definition of inheritance?" She smiled. "So are you." He looked around. "At least mine smells like basil." They both laughed. Soft, real. Later that week, Amelia visited the downtown shelter again. No reporters, no announcements, just crates of donated diapers. Warm coats, handwritten cards that read, "You are not invisible. You are deeply loved." Renee met her at the door with a hug. "You know," she said, "when you first walked in, I didn't recognize you." Amelia smiled. "I didn't recognize myself then either." Outside, snow began to fall again, but this time it felt different. Gentler, as if the season had made peace with what it was letting go. Julian packed light. One bag, one note on the kitchen counter, no explanation, just helping a friend rebuild a cabin. Back in a week or two. He zipped up his coat, glanced once toward the staircase, and stepped outside into the grey morning. The air was cold, not bitter, but sharp. The kind that made things feel more final than they were. He told himself it was just a trip, just some time, just space to think. But the truth was simpler. He was scared. Not of Amelia, not of Grace, not even of staying. He was scared of mattering, of being needed, of becoming someone she and Grace looked for in the morning, someone who'd leave a shape behind if he ever disappeared. Because love wasn't new to him. But this kind of love, the kind that crept in quietly and made a home in your chest, that was terrifying. He stood at gate 17. Same one where they met. Same bench where Amelia had first leaned into his shoulder without a word. Funny how a place could mean absolutely nothing one day, and everything the next. He glanced at the clock. Final boarding in 5 minutes. He reached for his bag. "Julian!" He turned. Amelia was running through the terminal, hair half pulled back, coat flapping behind her, cheeks flushed red from cold or panic or both. In her arms, Grace bounced in a pink wool hat, wide-eyed. She skidded to a stop in front of him, breathless. "I wasn't sure you'd leave," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he replied. She blinked fast, trying to find the right words, the right volume, the right way to stop a man from walking away without begging him to stay. "I didn't come to ask you out of guilt," she said. I came because I've spent most of my life not saying what I feel until it's too late. He stayed still. Let her speak. I don't need a fairy tale. I don't need promises written in stone, she said, voice cracking. I just need you to know. You're the first man who ever stood still long enough for me to rest, and the only one who never asked me to be anything but real. Julian felt something shift in his chest, a knot loosening, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for years. Grace gurgled softly in Amelia's arms and reached one tiny hand toward his coat. He touched her fingers gently. What about her? He asked. She ready for a guy who burns pancakes and sings lullabies off-key? Amelia smiled through her tears. She already thinks you're a magician. Julian dropped his bag. Good, he said quietly, because I think I'm starting to believe it too. She laughed, even as she cried. And then, without fanfare, without rush, he stepped forward and pressed his forehead gently against hers. The terminal faded around them, the announcements, the strangers watching. All of it. There was just her and him. And the child they were beginning to raise not by blood, but by choice. He didn't kiss her, not yet. Just held her hand, tight, warm. True. Later that evening, back at the estate, Julian unpacked his small bag. Amelia placed his boots by the fireplace like she had always meant for them to be there. Grace crawled in excited circles across the living room rug, giggling at nothing in particular. Julian sat down beside her and looked up at Amelia. I was running, he admitted. She nodded. I know. I thought if I left now, it wouldn't hurt as much later. And? He looked around. The fire. The light. The sound of Grace babbling to Huck in the corner. I forgot. You can't outrun what finally makes you whole. She stepped closer. Then what now? Julian reached for her hand. Now we build something that lasts, he said. One room, one laugh, one imperfect song at a time. Amelia sat at the small oak desk in Grace's room, the only light coming from the string of warm fairy lights overhead. It was well past midnight. Julian had fallen asleep downstairs with Huck at his feet, a half-finished book resting on his chest. The house was still. She opened the drawer and pulled out a piece of stationery. Cream-colored, no lines. She uncapped her pen and began to write. My sweet Grace, if you're reading this someday, you're probably old enough to ask the hard questions, and old enough to hear the truth. So here it is. Before you were born, I was scared of the world. I wore nice clothes and spoke politely and said, I'm fine, even when I wasn't. I thought surviving meant being silent. But then you came. And everything changed. She paused, letting the pen rest for a moment. Outside, snow was falling again. The kind that whispered when it touched the glass. You don't remember the apartment we lived in after you were born, but I do. I remember the leak in the bathroom ceiling, the sound of the city buses at 4 a.m., the way you'd fall asleep on my chest because it was the only place warm enough. I remember not having answers. I remember holding you and wondering if love was enough to pay rent. And yet somehow we kept waking up. That's the first thing I want you to remember, Grace. You are proof that love can survive in impossible places. Her handwriting wavered slightly. She blinked back tears and kept going. You were named after something I lost for a long time and then found again in you. Grace is not weakness. It's the quiet power of standing back up after life has knocked you down. And my darling girl, life will try. Some people will underestimate you. Some will try to define you. Some will walk away when you need them most. But here's what I hope you'll carry. You don't need to be anyone else to be worthy. Not prettier, not louder, not safer. You are enough as you are, and you always have been. Amelia let the silence fill the room for a moment. Then she continued, I wish I could shield you from the sharp edges of this world, but I can't. What I can give you is a map, a memory, a truth stitched into your spine. Here it is. Home is not built by walls or last names or perfect timing. It's built by kindness, by people who show up, by second chances, even when they feel undeserved. You and I, we were given one of those second chances by a man who didn't try to fix us but stood beside us long enough for us to heal ourselves. If you grow up and call Julian your father, it won't be because he gave you his name. It'll be because he gave you his time, his honesty, his laughter, and that more than blood is what makes someone a parent. She took a breath and smiled, thinking of the way Grace curled up beside Julian on rainy afternoons, content as if she'd known him forever. I want you to grow bold. Dance in grocery stores. Cry in public if you have to. Speak truth, even when your voice shakes. You come from women who endured storms and found beauty anyway. But more than enduring, I want you to choose joy, not because life is easy, but because joy is defiance. And darling, we were born to defy what tries to dim us. She set the pen down, folded the letter, and slipped it into a small white envelope. On the front, she wrote in careful script, "For Grace, when the time is right." Then she rose, kissed her daughter's sleeping forehead, and tucked the letter into the back of the cedar chest, behind the quilts and picture books. Not for now, but for someday. Someday, when Grace might question herself. Someday when the world forgets to be kind. Someday when she'll need to be reminded that her mother didn't just love her. She believed in her. The sun rose slowly over the Westbrook estate, spilling gold across the snow-covered lawn like spilled honey. Inside, the house was already alive with the quiet hum of a new day. Julian stood in the kitchen barefoot, frying pancakes shaped like stars. Grace, wearing a tiny apron with boss lady stitched on it, sat on the counter supervising. Amelia leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching the two people who had made her believe in mornings again. No perfect timing, no grand gestures, just three hearts learning how to beat in sync. She smiled. She didn't need more. But that afternoon, something changed. Julian asked her to come to the greenhouse. She followed the stone path, expecting to see new planters or herbs, but stopped short at the entrance. Inside, everything had bloomed overnight. Hanging baskets of jasmine, rows of wildflowers in full color, Grace's name written in soil along the edge of the flower beds with marigold petals. Julian turned from the center of the room. He wasn't holding a ring. He wasn't on one knee. He wasn't dressed for ceremony. He was just him, denim shirt. Rolled sleeves, mud on his boots, but his eyes held everything sacred. I thought about proposing, he began, in the traditional way, candlelight, a diamond. All the things people expect. Amelia stepped closer, her heart steady, but soft. But then I remembered, he continued, you never needed a stage. You never needed an audience. You just needed someone who would stand beside you in the dark until the light came back. He pointed to the center of the greenhouse. There stood a handcrafted wooden bench wide enough for three. Carved into the backrest, with steady hands and imperfect grace, were the words, "Let's grow old here." Julian looked at her. No big speech. No will you marry me with violins in the background. Just this. I'm not asking for your yes to a ceremony. I'm asking for your yes to the ordinary days, to missed alarms and take-out dinners, to shared grocery lists and bedtime stories. He stepped closer. To building something that doesn't make headlines, but makes sense. Amelia's throat tightened. Her chest lifted and fell, with the kind of emotion that didn't come with words, just knowing. She reached for his hand. Yes, she whispered. To all of it. Grace toddled in just then, holding a toy phone and a daisy. Mummy, Daddy flower for you. Amelia knelt down, took the daisy from her little hand, and tucked it behind Julian's ear. Grace squealed with laughter, and in that moment, just laughter and dirt on their knees and a promise carved into cedar, it was done. No rings, no cake, no fanfare, but they were a family. And the world, with all its noise and expectation, didn't need to know. That evening, they danced in the living room. Julian played a scratchy old record. Amelia swayed in his arms barefoot. Grace spun in slow circles beside them, hair flying like she was chasing stars. Outside, the first real thaw of spring melted the icicles from the roof. Inside, time slowed, and for the first time in a long, long while they weren't waiting for the other shoe to drop. They weren't bracing for heartbreak. They weren't surviving. They were simply living. Together. Epilogue. 1 year later. The greenhouse now bore a new sign over the door. The Carter Westbrook Garden. It had become a space for healing. Julian opened it every Saturday to women from the shelter. Amelia taught Grace how to plant tulip bulbs in silence and then sing to them after. And every person who walked through those doors carried away something invisible. Not just hope, but proof that love doesn't need a script. It just needs two people and a reason to stay. In a world that often moves too fast and speaks too loud, Amelia's story reminds us that healing doesn't always come from grand gestures, it comes from quiet kindness, from someone who stays when you're at your most broken. She didn't need rescuing. She needed someone who would sit beside her in the dark until the light returned. This story is for those who've known loss, for single parents, for anyone who thought their best days were behind them. It says, it's never too late to begin again, to be loved for who you are, not who you used to be. Julian didn't show up with a diamond ring. He brought a handmade wooden bench and a simple invitation. Let's live this life together. And that was enough. For those of us who've weathered storms, the greatest gift isn't a perfect ending, it's someone to sit beside when the winds have finally calmed. Never believe kindness has no place in this world. It still does. And sometimes it starts with you.